A father's love knows no overtime. When maintenance worker David stays late to craft something special from office scraps, he has no idea the CEO is watching through security cameras. What starts as a simple act of devotion becomes a moment that changes everything, proving that the most powerful gifts aren't bought. They're built with hands that shake from exhaustion and hearts that refuse to give up. Sometimes the smallest gestures echo the loudest, and sometimes being seen when you think you're invisible is exactly what the world needs. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song across the empty office floors, casting everything in that particular shade of corporate exhaustion. David Martinez pushed his cleaning cart past rows of vacant cubicles, the wheels squeaking a rhythm he'd memorized over 3 years of night shifts. 11:30 p.m. Most of the building had been dark for hours. He stopped at desk 247, always desk 247 first, because Mrs. Chen from accounting left her coffee mug in exactly the same spot every day, and somehow that small consistency felt like an anchor in the drift of identical workstations. The elevator dinged somewhere behind him. David glanced up, expecting to see Jerry from security making his rounds, but the footsteps that echoed across the marble lobby were different. Heavier, more purposeful. Richard Holbrook stepped into the light spilling from the elevator bank, his tailored suit wrinkled in a way that spoke of 18-hour days and boardroom battles. The CEO never worked this later. If he did, David had never seen him. Their worlds operated on different schedules, different floors, different universes entirely. Holbrook paused, seeming to notice David for the first time in 3 years of shared building space. A nod. Brief, polite. The kind of acknowledgement that said, "I see you exist," without committing to anything more. "Working late tonight," Holbrook said, and David couldn't tell if it was a question or an observation. "Every night, sir." "Right. Of course." The CEO disappeared into his corner office, and David returned to his routine. Trash bins, vacuum lines in the carpet, polish the conference table until it gleamed like still water. But tonight felt different. Tonight, David kept glancing at the clock, calculating minutes and hours and the distance between here and home, where his 8-year-old son Marcus was sleeping in a bedroom that felt too empty, too quiet, too full of things they couldn't afford to fill it with. Tomorrow was Marcus's birthday. The thought sat in David's chest like a stone. 9 years old. 9 candles on a cake he'd have to buy from the grocery store clearance rack. 9 wishes that David couldn't grant no matter how hard he worked, how many extra shifts he picked up, how many floors he mopped until his knees ached and his back screamed. Marcus had been asking about a bike for months. Not demanding. Marcus never demanded anything. Just mentioning it in that careful way kids learn when they know money is tight and dreams are expensive. "There's this kid at school, his bike has these lights that flash when you pedal," Marcus had said last week, arranging his Hot Wheels cars on the kitchen table with the methodical precision of a child who took care of his few possessions. "I bet I could ride to school if I had a bike. Save you gas money." 8 years old and already trying to solve problems that weren't his to solve. David emptied another trash bin, the sound of crumpled papers hitting the bottom of his cart unnaturally loud in the silence. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out below like a circuit board, all glowing connections and pulsing lights. Somewhere out there, other fathers were reading bedtime stories, teaching their kids to ride bikes, being present for the small moments that added up to childhood. He was here, always here. The elevator dinged again, and David expected to see Holbrook leaving, but the CEO emerged with his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking like a man settling in for the long haul. "Excuse me," Holbrook called across the floor. "David, right?" David stopped pushing his cart. "Yes, sir. How long have you worked here?" 3 years next month." Holbrook walked closer, and David noticed the fatigue in his eyes, the way his expensive watch caught the fluorescent light. "You have family?" "A son." "How old?" "He turns 9 tomorrow." Something shifted in Holbrook's expression. "Brief." almost imperceptible. That's a good age. Yes, sir. They stood in the space between cubicles, surrounded by empty desks and sleeping computers, two men from different worlds finding themselves in the same fluorescent purgatory at nearly midnight. I should let you get back to work, Holbrook said, but he didn't move. It's fine, sir. Big plans for the birthday? David felt the question settle in his throat. How do you explain to a man who probably spent more on lunch than David made in a week that 9-year-old birthday plans involved dollar store decorations and borrowed hope? We'll figure something out, David said. Holbrook nodded like he understood, but David knew he couldn't. Not really. Not the weight of being the only parent, the only income, the only person standing between your child and the kind of disappointment that shapes who they become. The CEO disappeared back into his office, and David returned to his cart, his routine, his careful choreography of making other people's messes disappear. But as he worked, pushing the vacuum across carpet that would be dirty again by tomorrow, he found himself thinking about the storage room on the 15th floor, about the boxes of old equipment that companies discarded when they upgraded, about the bicycle wheel he'd seen there last week, still good, just part of an exercise bike that nobody wanted anymore. The idea grew quietly in the back of his mind, the way desperate ideas do when you're running out of options and running out of time. By 2 a.m., David had finished his assigned floors. The building settled into its deepest quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in places built for noise and activity when they're finally allowed to rest. He should have gone home, should have clocked out, driven his 15-year-old Honda through empty streets, crawled into bed for a few hours before Marcus woke up expecting birthday magic that David couldn't provide. Instead, he took the elevator to 15. The storage room smelled like dust and abandonment, fluorescent bulbs flickering over piles of outdated technology and forgotten furniture. David found what he was looking for in the back corner, the exercise bike, a sleek, stationary model that someone had decided was taking up too much space in the executive gym. The wheels were perfect, barely used. Real bicycle wheels with good rubber tires and chrome spokes that caught the weak light like promises. David looked around the room, cataloging possibilities. A desk chair with a solid frame but torn upholstery, some old computer cables, a few pieces of metal shelving that might be repurposed. The beginning of something that might, with enough work and enough hope, become something else. He started with the wheels. Getting them off the exercise bike required tools he didn't have, so David made quiet trips to the maintenance closet, carrying what he needed in small loads, working as silently as possible. The building's security cameras would record everything, but Jerry only checked them if there was a problem, and David wasn't taking anything that would be missed. He was repurposing, giving new life to things that had been thrown away. The work was slow, methodical. David's hands, rough from years of cleaning chemicals and manual labor, moved with surprising delicacy as he dismantled and rebuilt, creating something new from discarded pieces. By 4 a.m., he had the basic frame, not pretty, not perfect, but functional. A bicycle built from office furniture and determination, held together with cable ties and careful engineering. It looked like exactly what it was, a father's midnight desperation given form, but it would roll. It would carry Marcus to school, to the park, to whatever adventures 9-year-old boys find when they finally have wheels to carry them there. David stepped back, wiping his hands on his uniform shirt, and for the first time in months felt something close to pride. The sound of footsteps in the hallway froze him, heavy, purposeful, the same footsteps from earlier. David quickly covered his work with a dustcloth from one of the shelves, his heart hammering as the footsteps grew closer. The storage room door was slightly ajar. He'd left it that way to listen for security round sand. Now light from the hallway painted a thin yellow line across the concrete floor. The footsteps stopped. David held his breath, standing perfectly still in the darkness, surrounded by the bones of his son's birthday present and the fear of losing everything he'd worked 3 years to build. A shadow moved across the light under the door. Then, quietly, the footsteps continued down the hall. David waited another 10 minutes before moving, his pulse slowly returning to normal. He uncovered the bicycle, added a few more touches, adjusting the seat height, tightening connections, making sure everything was as secure as he could make it without proper tools. Dawn was breaking over the city by the time he finished, pink and gold light streaming through the high windows of the storage room. The bicycle looked even more improvised in daylight, its mismatched components and creative engineering fully visible, but it was beautiful in its own way. Beautiful the way desperate love always is. David wheeled it carefully to the service elevator, rode down to the parking garage, and loaded it into the back of his Honda. The frame barely fit, handlebars twisted to clear the rear window, but it fit. He drove through empty morning streets, the city still sleeping, still dreaming, still full of fathers who had never had to build birthday presents from office furniture at 5 a.m. When he pulled into the driveway of his small rental house, Marcus was standing at the living room window in his pajamas, face pressed against the glass like he'd been waiting all night. David smiled and waved, then carefully unloaded the bicycle, wheeling it up the front walk as his son burst through the door. "Dad? Dad, is that for me?" The bicycle looked different in the morning light, more obviously cobbled together, more clearly the product of desperation and determination. David saw it through Marcus's eyes and felt a flutter of uncertainty. But Marcus was already running his hands over the chrome spokes, testing the bell David had fashioned from a small piece of metal shelving, his face lit with the kind of pure joy that adults forget is possible. "It's perfect," Marcus said, and David knew his son meant it. "Happy birthday, buddy." Marcus looked up at him, and David saw tears in his 8-year-old eyes. 9-year-old eyes now. "You made this for me?" "I made this for you." Marcus hugged him then, fierce and tight, and David felt something ease in his chest. The stone of worry that had been sitting there for months, maybe years, cracking just enough to let in light. They spent the morning in the driveway, David running alongside as Marcus learned to balance, to pedal, to trust that the wheels would hold and the brakes would work, and the father who built this thing from scraps and love knew what he was doing. By noon, Marcus was riding circles around the block, hair flying, voice carrying pure joy back to where David stood watching from the front porch. The bicycle held together, every joint, every improvised connection, every desperate decision made in a storage room at 4 a.m. it all held. David watched his son disappear around the corner and reappear moments later, pedaling hard, grinning like he'd discovered flight. It was perfect. Monday morning arrived with the weight of routine. David's alarm buzzed at 6 a.m., the same as always, but everything felt different. Through his bedroom window, he could see Marcus's bicycle leaning against the porch railing, morning dew catching on the spokes like tiny diamonds. Marcus was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, dressed for school but stealing glances out the window every few seconds. "Can I ride it to school?" he asked before David had even poured his coffee. "It's pretty far, buddy. I timed it yesterday. 12 minutes to the corner store and back." "School's only 8 minutes." David paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. Marcus had timed it. Of course he had. His son approached everything with the same methodical precision, a trait born from years of making the most of very little. "What about when it rains?" "I'll walk then, just like always." The logic was sound, the bike was sturdy. David had tested every joint, every connection. And Marcus had that careful way about him, the kind of kid who looked both ways twice and never took unnecessary risks. "Okay," David said. "But helmet." Marcus's face lit up. "We don't have a helmet." "Right, of course they didn't." Helmets cost money, and money went to rent and groceries and the endless small emergencies that define life on the margins. "I'll figure something out," David said. The same words he'd used with Holbrook 2 nights ago. The same words he used for everything these days. Marcus nodded like he understood, which broke David's heart a little. 9 years old and already fluent in the language of making do. David drove Marcus to school that morning, the bicycle secured in the back of the Honda. They'd compromised Marcus could ride home, test the route, learn the traffic patterns. baby steps toward independence. The conversation at drop-off was brief, routine. Same as always, except for the way Marcus kept turning to look at the bike through the rear window, like he was making sure it was real. "Pick you up at 3?" David asked. "I can ride home today? We'll see how you feel after school." Marcus hugged him longer than usual and ran toward the building with a lightness in his step that David hadn't seen in months. The drive to work felt different, too. David found himself thinking about the storage room, about security cameras, about the possibility that someone might ask questions about missing equipment. But the exercise bike had been there for weeks, dust-covered and forgotten. Nobody would miss it. Still, unease settled in his stomach like cold coffee. The morning shift at Hamilton Industries passed normally. David cleaned the same offices, emptied the same trash bins, followed the same routine he'd perfected over 3 years. But every time he passed a security camera, he felt exposed. It was ridiculous. He hadn't stolen anything, had barely taken anything that would be missed. The exercise bike was destined for disposal anyway, he just accelerated the process. But guilt doesn't follow logic, and David found himself jumping at shadows, expecting security to corner him at any moment. Lunch break came at noon. David usually ate in the employee break room, a peanut butter sandwich and whatever fruit was on sale that week. But today he felt restless, nervous energy, making it impossible to sit still. He decided to walk. The Hamilton Industries building sat in the heart of downtown, surrounded by coffee shops and restaurants that catered to the business crowd. David rarely ventured into this part of the city during daylight hours. His world was mostly night shifts and empty buildings and the quiet spaces between other people's lives. But now, walking among the lunch crowd in his maintenance uniform, he felt invisible in a different way. Not the comfortable invisibility of night work, but the sharp invisibility of class boundaries, of being the person who cleaned up after everyone else's day. He was passing a bicycle shop when he stopped. The window display featured a child's helmet, bright blue with cartoon characters. $24, according to the price tag. David stared at it through the glass, calculating. $24 was groceries for 2 days. $24 was Marcus's school lunch money for a week. $24 was also his son's safety. David pushed through the door, the bell chiming his entrance into a world of expensive bikes and specialized gear. The salesperson, a college-aged kid with perfectly styled hair, looked up from his phone with barely concealed impatience. "Help you? I need a helmet," David said. "For a 9-year-old. The kid gestured vaguely toward the wall display. "Kids' helmets are over there. Prices start at $30. David's heart sank. The one in the window must have been old stock, or maybe he'd misread the tag. $30. Might as well be $300. He walked over anyway, touching the colorful helmets, checking price tags with growing desperation. $35, $42, $58 for one with LED lights that Marcus would love and David couldn't afford in 1,000 years. "Actually," the salesperson said, appearing beside him, "we've got some used ones in the back. Trade-ins. They're still good, just not pretty." Hope flickered. "How much?" $15 for a basic one. They're all safety certified, just scuffed up." $15. David could do 15. It meant ramen noodles for dinner instead of the chicken he'd planned, but it was doable. "Can I see them?" The kid disappeared into the back room and returned with a cardboard box full of helmets in various states of wear. David sorted through them, looking for one that would fit Marcus, that wasn't too scratched or faded. Near the bottom he found it. A simple black helmet, barely used, just a few small scrapes on the back. Perfect size, $15. "This one," David said. The transaction was quick, anonymous. David paid in cash, exact change, and walked out with the helmet in a plain brown bag. The relief he felt was disproportionate to the purchase. Just a helmet, just $15, but it represented something larger, the completion of a gift, the closing of a circle he'd started 2 nights ago in a storage room. He was walking back toward Hamilton Industries when he saw the police car. Not unusual in downtown, cops were always around, keeping order among the lunch crowd and business district. But this one was parked directly in front of his building, and David's stomach dropped as he recognized the unmarked sedan beside it. Security. David slowed his pace, trying to look casual, while every instinct screamed at him to run. Had someone reported the missing exercise bike? Had Jerry finally checked the security footage? He forced himself to keep walking, to enter the building through the employee entrance like he did every day. The lobby was normal people coming and going, the usual midday bustle. No one looked at him twice. But as David waited for the elevator, he noticed Jenkins from security talking to a police officer near the reception desk. Their voices were low, serious, professional. The elevator doors opened, and David stepped inside, pressing the button for the 14th floor where his afternoon assignments waited. But as the doors closed, he caught Jenkins pointing toward the elevator bank. David's hands shook as he reached his supply closet. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the police were here about something else entirely, a break-in, a complaint. Anything other than a maintenance worker who'd repurposed office furniture for his son's birthday. But the helmet in his bag felt heavy now, weighted with the possibility that he might not have a job to pay for it. The afternoon passed in slow motion. Every footstep in the hallway made David's pulse spike. Every phone ring, every elevator ding, every normal sound of office life felt like a countdown to consequences he couldn't afford. At 2:30, David's radio crackled to life. David Martinez to security office. David Martinez to security office. The walk down felt eternal. David's mind raced through explanations, justifications, desperate stories about misunderstandings and good intentions, but he knew how it would sound, how it would look. Employee steals company property for personal use. The security office was small, cramped, lined with monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. Jenkins sat behind his desk, expression unreadable. The police officer was gone, but a woman in a business suit sat in the corner chair, someone from HR, probably. "David?" Jenkins said. "Thanks for coming down. Is there a problem? We had some questions about Saturday night. You worked late?" David's mouth went dry. "I always work late. Night shift. Right? But you were here past your usual time. Until almost 6 a.m., according to the logs." The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. David could lie, could claim he'd been doing extra cleaning, working on special projects. But the security footage would tell the real story. "I can explain," David said. Jenkins leaned back in his chair. "I'm sure you can. But before you do, I want you to watch something." He turned one of the monitors toward David, fingers working the keyboard to pull up recorded footage. The timestamp showed Saturday night, 11:47 p.m. The view was from a camera in the 15th floor hallway, pointed directly at the storage room door. David watched himself appear on screen, pushing his cleaning cart, looking around nervously before entering the room. The footage jumped ahead 12:23 a.m. David emerging with the exercise bike wheel, 1:15 a.m., carrying cables and chair parts. 2:45 a.m., wheeling something covered with a dust cloth. The evidence was complete, undeniable, recorded in high definition. "Want to tell me what you were doing?" Jenkins asked. David looked at the woman from HR, at Jenkins, at his own guilty face frozen on the security monitor. He thought about Marcus, probably getting out of school right now, maybe asking his teacher if his dad was coming to pick him up or if he could ride his new bike home. "My son turned 9 yesterday," David said quietly. "I couldn't afford to buy him a birthday present." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of traffic 15 floors below. "So, you stole company property?" the HR woman said. Not a question. "I repurposed equipment that was being thrown away," David said, but even as he said it, he knew how weak it sounded. "Equipment that doesn't belong to you," she continued. "Equipment you took without permission for personal use." David nodded. There was no point in arguing. The footage spoke for itself. "I can pay for it," he said desperately. "Whatever it cost. I can work extra shifts, have it taken out of my paycheck." Jenkins and the HR woman exchanged a look that David couldn't read. The exercise bike was valued at $1,200 when we purchased it, she said. Even used, we're talking about significant company property. $1,200. The number hit David like a physical blow. 3 months of his take-home pay, money he would never have, could never find. I didn't know, he whispered. That's not really the point, is it? The HR woman opened a folder on her lap, pulled out forms that David recognized even from across the room. Termination papers. Company policy is very clear about theft of property. David felt the world narrow to this small room, these 3 people. This moment, where everything he'd worked for over 3 years collapsed into consequences he couldn't escape. Please, he said, I have a son, this Jobit's all we have. The HR woman's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained professional. I'm sorry, David, I really am. But policy is policy. Jenkins cleared his throat. Actually, there's something else you should see. He turned to another monitor, pulled up different footage. Same timestamp, but this camera showed the executive floor. David watched Richard Holbrook emerge from his office at 4:23 a.m., walk down the hallway, pause outside the storage room. The CEO had known, had seen everything, had probably been the one to report it. But as David watched, something unexpected happened on the screen. Holbrook stood outside the storage room for nearly 5 minutes, not entering, not calling security. Just standing there, listening to the sounds of David working inside. Then he walked away. Mr. Holbrook asked to review the footage personally, Jenkins said, before we made any decisions. And? David asked, though he was afraid to hope. He wants to see you in his office. Now. The elevator to the executive floor felt like a confessional booth, small, silent, ascending toward judgment. David clutched the brown bag containing Marcus's helmet. His hands slick with sweat, despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. Richard Holbrook's corner office occupied real estate that probably cost more per month than David made in a year. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, all glass towers and busy intersections spreading out like a circuit board beneath the afternoon sun. Holbrook sat behind a desk the size of David's kitchen table, reviewing documents with the focused intensity of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. He didn't look up immediately when David entered, didn't acknowledge the knock that the secretary had announced. David stood in the doorway, unsure whether to advance or wait, the silence stretching between them like a held breath. "Close the door," Holbrook said without looking up. David obeyed. The soft click of the latch, sealing them into a space that felt both intimate and impossibly vast. The office smelled like expensive leather and subtle cologne, the kind of refined atmosphere that reminded David exactly how far he was from his world of industrial cleaners and fluorescent lights. "Sit down." David approached the chair across from Holbrook's discreal. Leather, the kind that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. He perched on the edge, the helmet bag crinkling in his lap. Holbrook finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Gray eyes that had probably stared down boardroom adversaries in million-dollar deals now focused on a maintenance worker who'd stolen company property to build his son a bicycle. "Tell me about your son," Holbrook said. Not what David had expected. He'd prepared for accusations, termination, possibly legal action. Not small talk about Marcus. "His name is Marcus. He turned 9 yesterday." "Just the 2 of you?" David nodded. "His mother left when he was 3. It's been just us since then." Holbrook leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his face. "That's hard." "We manage. Do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. David thought about his carefully balanced lift rent and groceries and utilities divided among paychecks that never quite stretched far enough. Thought about Marcus eating cereal for dinner sometimes because the milk was cheaper than meat. Thought about birthday presents built from office furniture at 4 a.m. because love doesn't always come with a budget. "We try to," David said honestly. Holbrook stood and walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city below. From this height, the people on the sidewalks looked like ants, busy and purposeful but ultimately insignificant. "I have a son too." Holbrook said. Had. He would have been 32 this year. Would have been. Past tense wrapped around a wound that even money couldn't heal. Car accident when he was 16. Holbrook continued. Drunk driver ran a red light. Kevin was just driving home from basketball practice. David felt the weight of unexpected grief settle between them. This wasn't the conversation he'd anticipated, wasn't the role he'd prepared to play. I'm sorry, David said. And meant it. You know what I remember most about Kevin at 9? Holbrook turned from the window, his composed executive mask slipping just enough to reveal something rawer underneath. He wanted this ridiculous Go cart, red with flame decals, cost $800, which seemed like nothing to me then. Holbrook returned to his desk, but didn't sit. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a tablet, fingers working the screen with practiced efficiency. I bought it online, had it delivered. Never even saw him open the box. I was traveling that week, closed some deal that seemed important at the time. He set the tablet on the desk, angled so David could see the screen. I found this in his room after the accident. The image showed a homemade go-kart, clearly built by young hands from plywood and skateboard wheels and determination. Rough around the edges but painted with care, flames hand-drawn in red marker along the sides. He never used the one I bought him, Holbrook said. $800, and it sat in our garage collecting dust while he spent weekends building this one with his grandfather. Said it was more fun to make something than to just buy it. David stared at the picture, seeing Marcus in the careful construction, recognizing the pride that came from creating something with your own hands. 9 years old, Holbrook continued, and he already understood something I didn't learn until it was too late. That the value isn't in what you spend, it's in what you give of yourself. The office fell quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft whisper of the ventilation system. David waited, unsure where this conversation was leading, afraid to hope it might lead anywhere good. I watched the security footage, Holbrook said finally. All of it. 4 hours of you working in that storage room, building something beautiful from things other people had thrown away. David's throat tightened. I know it was wrong. I know I shouldn't have. Wrong? Holbrook cut him off. You spent your Saturday night, your time off, your energy, creating something meaningful for your son. Using equipment that was literally scheduled for disposal next week. He gestured toward the tablet, toward the image of his son's homemade go-kart. What's wrong is that I never learned to do what you did. David felt lost in the conversation, unsure what Holbrook was asking of him, what response was expected. I don't understand. Holbrook sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. How much do you make, David? The question was direct, uncomfortably personal. David hesitated. It's not a trap, just honest curiosity from someone who signs the paychecks but never really thinks about what they mean. $22,000 a year, David said quietly, plus overtime when it's available. Holbrook nodded like he'd expected the number, but David saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of a reality he'd somehow never considered. And rent? $800 a month. Food, utilities, car payment? David did the math out loud, the same calculations he ran every month, every week, sometimes every day. The careful balancing act of survival that left no room for extras, for bicycle helmets, for the small luxuries that other families took for granted. Not much left over, Holbrook observed. No, sir. But you made it work. You found a way to give your son something meaningful for his birthday. David shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. I use company property without permission. I understand if you have to fire me. Fire you? Holbrook laughed, but there was no humor in it. David, I want to hire you. The words made no sense. David blinked, certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry? I've been watching this company, really watching it, for the past 6 months. Productivity, efficiency, employee satisfaction. We're succeeding by most measures, but we're missing something essential. Holbrook stood again, began pacing behind his desk. We've got brilliant minds, innovative products, cutting-edge technology, but we've lost touch with the kind of resourcefulness, the creativity, the pure human ingenuity that built this place. David listened, still not understanding where this was headed. You took discarded equipment and turned it into something beautiful, something functional, something that solved a real problem for someone you care about. Holbrook stopped pacing, fixed David with that gray-eyed stare. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of around here. I don't understand what you're asking. I'm offering you a position in our innovation lab, research and development. We need people who can see potential in things others have given up on, who can create solutions with limited resources. David felt like the floor had shifted beneath his feet. I'm a maintenance worker. I clean offices. You're a problem solver who happens to clean offices. There's a difference. The offer hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting and terrifying all at once. David thought about Marcus, about the bicycle built from spare parts, about the helmet in his lap that represented $15 he couldn't afford and love he couldn't quantify. What would it pay? David asked, feeling guilty for asking but needing to know. Starting salary would be $55,000. Full benefits, including health insurance and educational assistance if you want to finish your degree. $55,000. More than double what David made now. Enough to rent a real apartment, to buy Marcus a proper bicycle, to stop choosing between groceries and utilities. I don't have any formal training, David said. No college degree. Some of our best innovations have come from people who think outside traditional frameworks. Your son's bicycle is proof that you understand engineering principles, resource allocation, creative problem solving. Holbrook returned to his seat. We can teach you the technical language. We can't teach you how to see possibilities where others see trash. David stared at the tablet screen, at the image of a 9-year-old's handmade go-kart, and felt something shift in his chest. Hope, maybe, or recognition of a path he'd never imagined possible. There's one condition, Holbrook said. David's heart sank. Of course there was a catch. I want you to bring your son's bicycle to the office. Display it in the innovation lab. Remind everyone who works there what real innovation looks like. David smiled for the first time since entering the office. He rides it to school now. It might be hard to get it away from him. We'll get him a new one, a proper one. But I want everyone to see what his father built for him with love and determination and a storage room full of cast-offs. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Details about the position, start date, logistics of transitioning from night maintenance to day shift in a completely different department. But David found himself thinking about Marcus, about picking him up from school, about having news that would change everything. When he finally left Holbrook's office, David's hands were shaking. Not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming vertigo of a life suddenly transformed. The elevator ride down felt like descent from an impossible dream. But the contract in his pocket, signed and official, proved it was real. David was halfway to his car when he remembered the helmet. Marcus would be getting out of school in 15 minutes. For the first time in 3 years, David wouldn't have to rush home to get ready for his night shift. For the first time in Marcus's life, David would be able to pick him up from school and spend the afternoon together, father and son, without the constant pressure of time and money and the exhaustion that came from working while the rest of the world slept. David drove toward Marcus's school with the radio turned up and the windows down, feeling lighter than he had in years. The helmet sat on the passenger seat beside Holbrook's business card and the signed contract that promised a future neither of them had dared to imagine. When David pulled into the school parking lot, Marcus was already waiting by the bike racks, helmetless head turning hopefully toward each arriving car. He spotted the Honda and waved, that huge smile that made every sacrifice worthwhile. "Dad, you're early. I thought maybe we could go to the park," David said, getting out to help Marcus load the bicycle into the back seat. "Try out this new helmet I found." Marcus examined the black helmet with the critical eye of a 9-year-old expert. "It's perfect. How much did it cost?" "Don't worry about it." "But Dad," Marcus. David knelt down to eye level with his son, hands on his shoulders. "Sometimes good things happen. Sometimes the universe decides to balance things out." Marcus studied his father's face, reading something in his expression that made his own features shift from concern to curiosity to hope. What kind of good things? The kind that mean you might not have to worry about helmet money anymore. The kind that mean maybe we can afford a few extras. David pulled out Holbrook's business card, showed Marcus the Hamilton Industries logo, the impressive title underneath Richard Holbrook's name. The CEO of your company gave you his card? He gave me a job, buddy. A better job. A job that means I can pick you up from school every day if you want. Marcus stared at the card, then at his father, then at the bicycle that had started everything. Because of my birthday bike? Because your dad is apparently better at building things than he knew. Marcus hugged him then, fierce and tight and full of 9-year-old understanding that sometimes the best gifts are the ones that keep on giving. As they drove toward the park, Marcus chattering excitedly about helmets and bikes and the possibility of his father being home for dinner every night, David caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 3 years, he looked like a man with a future. 3 months later, the Hamilton Industries Innovation Lab hummed with the quiet energy of minds at work. The space had been redesigned since David's arrivalist sterile corporate environment, more workshop aesthetic. Whiteboards covered with sketches and equations lined the walls, and in the center of the room, mounted on a custom display stand, sat Marcus's bicycle. The improvised birthday present had become something of a legend within the company. New employees were brought by to see it during orientation. Engineers referenced it in presentations about creative problem solving, and David had lost count of how many executives had stopped by to run their fingers along the makeshift frame and ask about the story behind it. David stood at his workstation, reviewing schematics for a water filtration system that could be built from readily available materials. A project born from his growing understanding that the best innovations often came from necessity, not abundance. His team was developing prototypes for disaster relief, systems that could provide clean water in areas where traditional infrastructure had failed. Martinez called Sarah Chen, the lab director, from across the room. Conference room in 5. Holbrook wants to see the quarterly presentation. David saved his work and gathered his materials. The quarterly reviews had become routine, but they still carried weight. The Innovation Lab was Holbrook's pet project, his attempt to inject practical creativity into a company that had grown perhaps too comfortable with conventional solutions. The conference room on the 20th floor offered the same panoramic city view as Holbrook's office, but the atmosphere was different, less formal, more collaborative. The mahogany table was covered with prototypes and sketches, evidence of 3 months' worth of breakthrough thinking. Holbrook entered with his usual purposeful stride, but David had learned to read the subtle signs, the slight relaxation around his eyes, the way he moved with less rigid control. The CEO was happier these days, more engaged with the work than the metrics. "Good afternoon, everyone," Holbrook said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "David, why don't you start with the disaster relief project?" David stood, activated the wall display, and began walking through their progress. Clean water systems built from PVC pipe and sand filters. Emergency shelters constructed from recycled materials. Solar charging stations assembled from components that could be sourced in any major city. "The key insight," David explained, "is that we're not trying to reinvent technology. We're reimagining how existing technology can be combined and deployed with minimal resources." The presentation continued for 20 minutes, David growing more confident as he spoke. 3 months ago, he'd been intimidated by rooms like this, by executives in expensive suits discussing budgets larger than his lifetime earnings. Now he understood that good ideas transcended background, that innovation was more about perspective than pedigree. "Impressive work," Holbrook said when David finished. "What's the timeline for field testing?" 6 weeks for the first prototypes, Sarah answered. "We're partnering with 3 relief organizations for initial deployment." "And costs?" "The beauty of David's approach is scalability," Sarah continued. "Each system can be built for under $200 using locally sourced materials. Compare that to traditional relief infrastructure." The conversation shifted to logistics and funding, the kind of detailed planning that transformed ideas into reality. David listened, contributed when asked, but found his mind wandering to Marcus, who was probably getting out of school right now. Since David's schedule changed, their afternoon routine had become sacred. Homework at the kitchen table while David cooked real dinner, not cereal or ramen but actual meals with vegetables and protein. Then time in the backyard, where Marcus practiced riding his original bicycle while David tinkered with projects, bringing work home, not because he had to but because he enjoyed it. The bicycle itself had evolved too. David had made improvements over the weeks: better brakes, more comfortable seat, LED lights powered by a small dynamo he'd built from spare electronics. Not because the original wasn't good enough, but because improvement was what they did now. Father and son, building things together, making them better. David? He snapped back to the present, realizing Holbrook had asked him a question. Sorry, I was thinking about implementation challenges. Holbrook smiled knowingly. I asked about your son. How's he adjusting to the changes? The question surprised David not because Holbrook asked, but because the concern seemed genuine. Over the past 3 months, their relationship had evolved from employer-employee to something more complex. Not friendship exactly, but mutual respect built on shared understanding of what it meant to be a father. He's good, really good. The stability has been. David paused, searching for words. It's meant everything. And the new bike? Holbrook had made good on his promise. A proper bicycle, professionally built, with gears and handbrakes and reflectors. Marcus loved it, rode it everywhere, took meticulous care of it. But the original remained special, parked in their garage like a shrine to the night. Everything changed. He has 2 now, David said. Uses the new one for long rides, but still prefers the original for school. Says it feels like home. Nods around the table. Everyone knew the story by now, had heard various versions of the Saturday night when a maintenance worker had unknowingly impressed the CEO by building something beautiful from discarded parts. Speaking of which, Holbrook said, I have something to discuss with you after the meeting. David nodded, returning his attention to the presentation as Sarah detailed their next phase of development. But unease crept into his thoughts. Private conversations with Holbrook could go either direction: promotion or problem, opportunity or obstacle. The meeting concluded with handshakes and scheduling, the usual corporate choreography of people important enough to have their time managed by others. David lingered as the room emptied, gathering his materials, while Holbrook reviewed notes on his tablet. When they were alone, Holbrook moved to the windows, his familiar position for difficult conversations. We've been invited to present at the International Innovation Summit in Geneva, he said without turning around. 3-day conference, 2,000 of the world's leading engineers and designers. David waited for the connection, unsure why Holbrook was sharing conference details with him. They want you to be the keynote speaker. The words hit David like a physical force. Keynote speaker, International Summit. 2,000 of the world's leading engineers. I think there's been a mistake, David said carefully. No mistake. They specifically requested you after seeing our disaster relief presentation online. They want to hear about practical innovation, about finding solutions with limited resources. Holbrook turned from the window, expression serious. They want to hear about the bicycle. David sat down heavily in the nearest chair. 3 months ago, he'd been emptying trash cans and worrying about $15 helmet purchases. Now someone wanted him to address an international conference about innovation. I can't do that, David said. I'm not a speaker. I don't have the background, the credentials. You have something better, Holbrook interrupted. You have authenticity. You've lived the kind of challenges that most of those engineers only read about in case studies. What would I even talk about? Holbrook returned to his seat, leaning forward with the focused intensity David had learned to recognize as his thinking mode. Tell them about Saturday night. Tell them about a father who loved his son enough to spend 4 hours in a storage room, building something meaningful from things other people had thrown away. Holbrook paused. Tell them about the difference between innovation and invention. about the difference between what we can afford and what we can create. David thought about Marcus, about the pride in his son's eyes when he'd first seen the handmade bicycle, about the letters they'd received from relief organizations excited about the water filtration prototypes, about the quiet satisfaction of solving problems that mattered to people who needed solutions. The conference is in 6 weeks. Holbrook continued. All expenses paid, obviously. You'd miss 2 days of work, but I think we can manage without you. David smiled at the gentle joke. 6 weeks to prepare a speech for some of the most accomplished engineers in the world. 6 weeks to figure out how to tell his story in a way that might inspire others to see possibilities instead of limitations. What if I embarrass us? What if I'm not ready for something like this? David, Holbrook said quietly, you've been ready for this your whole life. You just didn't know it. The conversation continued for another few minutes. Logistics, travel arrangements, the suggestion that Marcus might enjoy seeing Switzerland during summer break. But David's mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what he wanted to say. What message might matter to people who could change the world if they remembered why they'd wanted to change it in the first place. When David finally left the office, he drove home through familiar streets that felt different now. The same route he'd taken for years, but seen from the perspective of someone whose life had been transformed by circumstances he'd never dared to imagine. Marcus was waiting in the driveway when David pulled in, both bicycles lined up beside him like he was conducting an inspection. Dad, look what I figured out. Marcus demonstrated his latest modification, a small mirror he'd attached to the handlebars of the original bike, angled so he could see behind him while riding. Simple, practical, effective. That's brilliant, buddy. How'd you think of that? Ms. Rodriguez was talking about problem-solving in math class. She said the best solutions are usually the simple ones. Marcus grinned up at his father. Like your bike for me. Simple but perfect. David knelt down, pulled Marcus into a hug that lasted longer than usual. His son smelled like playground dust and childhood sweat, the most beautiful scent in the world. What if I told you we might get to take a trip together this summer? David said. Somewhere really special? Where? Switzerland. There's a conference where I'm supposed to give a speech. Marcus pulled back, eyes wide. A speech about what? About you, about us, about what happens when people who love each other find ways to make impossible things possible. Marcus considered this with 9-year-old seriousness, then nodded like it made perfect sense. Can I help you write it? I'd like that. They spent the evening in the backyard, Marcus riding circles around the small space while David sketched ideas for his presentation. Not formal notes, just thoughts about fatherhood and creativity, and the way necessity could become the mother of invention when love provided the blueprint. As the sun set over their neighborhood, the same small houses and careful lawns, but somehow more beautiful now, David watched his son practice tricks on the bicycle that had started everything. The bike held together perfectly, every improvised joint as strong as the day he'd built it. But more than that, it had become a symbol of what was possible when you refused to accept that circumstances defined capability. Marcus rode past him again, calling out, "Dad, watch this," before attempting a small jump over a garden hose. David watched, heart in his throat, until Marcus landed safely, both of them laughing as the bicycle continued rolling forward, carrying his son toward whatever came next. In 6 weeks, David would stand before 2,000 engineers and tell them about this moment, about love that builds bridges from spare parts, about the innovation that happens when you have everything to lose and everything to give. But tonight was just a father and son in a backyard, perfecting the art of making dreams roll forward on wheels built from determination and hope. The Geneva Convention Center rose from Lake Geneva's shoreline like a glass monument to human ambition, its curved surfaces reflecting both the Swiss Alps and the nervous face of a maintenance worker from Ohio who was supposed to address 2,000 of the world's brightest minds in 3 hours. David stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his hotel room, watching morning light dance across the water while Marcus slept in the bed behind him. The past 6 weeks of preparation felt simultaneously like a lifetime, and an instant countless evenings crafting and recrafting his speech, practicing in front of Marcus, who offered feedback with the brutal honesty only children possess. "Dad?" Marcus's voice came sleepy from the pillows. "Is it time?" "Not yet, buddy. Few more hours." Marcus sat up, hair sticking in directions that defied physics, and joined David at the window. Below them, the city of Geneva awakened with quiet efficiency people walking purposefully along the lake, early morning joggers, the distant hum of a world going about its business. "Are you nervous?" Marcus asked. David considered the question. Terrified was more accurate. Somewhere in that convention center, engineers who had designed satellites and medical devices and systems that kept entire cities running were gathering to hear what he had to say about innovation. "Yeah," David admitted, pretty nervous. "Want to practice again?" They'd run through the speech so many times that Marcus could probably deliver it himself. But the ritual had become comforting, a way of grounding the impossible reality of being here, in this moment, with this opportunity. Once more, couldn't hurt. Marcus positioned himself cross-legged on the bed, assuming his role as audience, while David stood near the window and began the words he'd memorized like a prayer. 3 years ago, I was invisible. Not metaphorically invisible, literally invisible. I cleaned office buildings at night, worked while the city slept, existed in the spaces between other people's lives. The opening felt different here, in this elegant hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva. The story that had begun in a storage room in Ohio now seemed destined for this moment, this audience, this chance to speak about the kind of innovation that happened not in labs or boardrooms, but in the quiet desperation of love meeting necessity. David continued through the familiar beats: Marcus's 9th birthday, the empty feeling of having nothing to give, the discovery of discarded equipment that could become something beautiful. But as he spoke, he found himself thinking not about the audience he would face in a few hours, but about the man who had made this possible. Richard Holbrook had flown to Geneva separately, arriving the day before for preliminary meetings with conference organizers. But he'd made a point of having dinner with David and Marcus the previous evening, sharing stories about his own son, about the regrets that came with success achieved at the cost of presence. Kevin would have loved this, Holbrook had said, watching Marcus build an elaborate castle from dinner rolls while they waited for their entrees. He had that same focused creativity, that same way of seeing possibilities where others saw just dinner rolls. The pain in Holbrook's voice was still evident, even years after the loss. But there was something else, a kind of healing that came from watching David and Marcus together, from seeing the kind of father-son relationship he'd never quite managed to build. "The conference should be interesting," Holbrook had continued. "A lot of very smart people who've forgotten what it feels like to need something you can't buy." David finished his practice run, and Marcus applauded with theatrical enthusiasm. "Perfect," Marcus declared. "But remember to pause after the part about the bicycle frame. That's the moment when everyone realizes what you actually built." 9 years old and already understanding dramatic timing, David smiled, feeling some of his nervousness ease. If he could tell this story to his son, he could tell it to anyone. They dressed careful David in the new suit Holbrook had insisted on buying, Marcus in clothes that made him look older, more sophisticated. The boy who had learned to ride on a bicycle built from office furniture now carried himself with quiet confidence, comfortable in spaces that would have intimidated his father just months ago. The taxi ride to the convention center passed in companionable silence, both of them watching Geneva flow past the window-ancient buildings, housing modern businesses, old-world elegance, adapting to contemporary needs. Not unlike David's own transformation, he realized. The convention center buzzed with controlled energy, thousands of people moving with purpose through spaces designed to facilitate the exchange of ideas. Digital displays announced sessions on artificial intelligence, sustainable energy, biotechnology, the cutting edge of human innovation rendered in bullet points and conference room assignments. David checked in at the registration desk, received his speaker badge and folder of materials, tried not to think about the fact that his name now appeared on the same program as Nobel laureates and technology pioneers. Mr. Martinez? A young woman with a British accent approached, tablet in hand. I'm Sarah from Conference Coordination. We're ready for your tech check whenever you are. The main auditorium was enormous, seats rising in steep tiers toward a ceiling that seemed impossibly high. The stage looked small from the back of the room, intimate despite the space around it. David tried to imagine it filled with people, all of them focused on him, waiting for words that might change how they thought about their work. The tech check was routine microphone levels, slide transitions, the basic choreography of modern presentations. But when David's first slide appeared on the massive screen behind the podium, he felt something shift in his understanding of the moment. The image was simple. Marcus's bicycle, photographed in the Hamilton Industries Innovation Lab, surrounded by the sophisticated equipment and whiteboards that now define David's daily work environment. The contrast was stark improvised craftsmanship surrounded by cutting-edge technology, necessity meeting abundance, love made visible through discarded office furniture. Beautiful shot, the technical coordinator said. Really drives home the message. David nodded, though he wasn't sure what message the coordinator thought he was seeing. For David, the image represented something more personal, the distance between where he'd been and where he was now, measured not in salary or status, but in possibility. The morning sessions proceeded with the usual conference rhythm presentations on breakthrough technologies, networking breaks fueled by expensive coffee, the constant undertone of ambition and achievement that characterized gatherings of people accustomed to changing the world. David attended what sessions he could, trying to calm his nerves by focusing on other speakers, other stories. But he found himself distracted, thinking about his own message, wondering whether his experience would resonate with people whose innovations measured in patents and profit margins rather than father-son moments in storage rooms. Lunch was an elegant affair in the convention center's main hall, round tables set with crystal and fine china, conversations flowing in multiple languages about projects that spanned continents and industries. David sat with Holbrook and a group of executives from various companies, listening to discussions about market penetration and regulatory challenges and the endless complexity of turning ideas into reality. "First time speaking at something like this?" asked a woman from a German automotive company. "First time speaking anywhere like this," David admitted. "What's your background? Academic or industry?" David felt the familiar moment of uncertainty, the slight disconnect that came when people tried to place him in categories that didn't quite fit. "Maintenance," he said simply. "I used to clean buildings at night." The conversation around the table paused, not awkwardly, but with genuine curiosity. David had learned that his story confused people. Initially, the narrative arc from janitor to innovation lab didn't follow conventional career paths. "And now you're in R&D?" the German executive continued. "Now I'm trying to help people solve problems with whatever resources they have available," David said. "Turns out that's a useful skill set." Holbrook smiled across the table. The expression of a man watching someone he'd bet on proved the wisdom of his investment. After lunch, David found himself alone in a quiet corridor, reviewing his notes one final time. The speech felt different now, informed by the morning sessions, by conversations with people whose work he'd only read about in magazines. But the core remained the same, a story about love finding a way, about creativity born from limitation, about the kind of innovation that happened when you couldn't afford to fail because failure meant disappointing the person who mattered most. "Dad?" Marcus appeared beside him, having spent the morning in a special program designed for younger conference attendees. His eyes were bright with excitement, full of the kind of wonder that came from seeing new possibilities. "How was your morning?" David asked. "Amazing. I met this engineer who designs prosthetic limbs, and she showed me how they use 3D printing to make custom joints for kids who are still growing." Marcus bounced slightly on his toes. "She said the best designs come from listening to what kids actually need, not what adults think they need." David smiled, recognizing the familiar theme. Innovation born from necessity, informed by real experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "Sounds like she'd understand your bicycle story." David said. That's what she said. She asked if I'd ever thought about engineering as a career. Marcus looked up at his father with an expression that mixed excitement and possibility. I think I might want to learn how to build things that help people. David felt something settle in his chest. A recognition that the bicycle had been more than just a birthday present, had been an introduction to a way of thinking, a demonstration that problems could be solved with creativity and determination. I think you'd be good at that, David said. The afternoon session began at 2 o'clock. David sat in the front row of the auditorium, watching as it filled with the kind of people he'd once only seen in newspapers and trade magazines. Engineers who had designed the International Space Station, researchers who were working on cures for diseases David couldn't pronounce, entrepreneurs whose companies employed thousands of people around the world, and in 30 minutes they would all be listening to him. Ladies and gentlemen, the conference moderator announced, please welcome our keynote speaker, David Martinez, speaking on Innovation from Necessity, Lessons from an Unlikely Source. David stood, legs steadier than he'd expected, and walked toward the stage. The applause was polite, professional, the sound of people willing to listen but not yet convinced they needed to hear what he had to say. He reached the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, found Marcus in the front row, giving him a thumbs up, and began to speak. 3 years ago, I was invisible. His voice carried clearly through the auditorium, amplified by technology, but grounded in truth. David told his story simply, honestly, without decoration or apology. He spoke about being a single father, about working night shifts, about the weight of wanting to give your child something meaningful when meaningful things cost more than you earn. He described the storage room, the discarded exercise bike, the 4 hours of midnight engineering that had changed everything. He talked about necessity as a design constraint, about love as a motivating force, about the kind of innovation that happened when you had no choice but to succeed. The audience listened with growing attention, and David could feel the moment when the room shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement. These were people accustomed to complex technical presentations, but they recognized something universal in his story, the drive to solve problems, to create solutions, to make something meaningful from available resources. When David clicked to the slide showing Marcus's bicycle, the auditorium fell completely silent. This is what innovation looks like when it's driven by love rather than profit, David said. When it's constrained by necessity rather than budget. When it's measured not in market share but in the smile on a 9-year-old's face. He paused, letting the image speak for itself, the careful construction, the creative engineering, the obvious pride in craftsmanship that transcended the improvised materials. The question I want you to consider, David continued, is not whether you can afford to innovate, but whether you can afford not to. Whether the solutions you're developing today will matter to the people who need them most. Whether the love that drives your work is visible in what you create. David spoke for 20 more minutes, weaving together stories from his own experience with observations about the projects he'd seen that morning, the technologies being developed by people in the audience, the potential for innovation to serve not just markets but humanity. When he finished, the applause was different, sustained, enthusiastic, the sound of recognition and respect. David looked out at 2,000 faces, saw people who had been moved by his words, who perhaps saw their own work differently now. But his eyes found Marcus first, his son beaming with pride that no amount of professional acclaim could match. The question and answer session lasted 40 minutes, engineers and executives asking about resource allocation, about scaling improvised solutions, about the role of constraints in driving creativity. David answered as honestly as he could, drawing from his experience in Hamilton Industries Innovation Lab, from the projects they developed for disaster relief, from the simple truth that the best solutions often came from the deepest needs. Afterward, as the auditorium emptied and people approached to continue conversations, David felt the same quiet satisfaction he'd experienced that Saturday morning 3 years ago, watching Marcus ride his handmade bicycle around the block. He'd built something meaningful, something that would carry them forward. Holbrook appeared at his elbow, expression proud and slightly emotional. "That was extraordinary," Holbrook said quietly. Kevin would have loved hearing that story. David looked at the older man, seeing not the powerful CEO but the father who had lost his son, who had found a kind of healing in watching David and Marcus build something beautiful together. "Thank you," David said, "for everything. For taking a chance on a maintenance worker who made a bicycle from office furniture." "Thank you," Holbrook replied, "for reminding me what innovation actually means." As the convention center emptied and Geneva settled into evening, David and Marcus walked along Lake Geneva's shoreline, the Alps rising like promises in the distance. Marcus rode his travel scooter, a compromise between his beloved bicycle and international airline regulations, while David matched his pace on foot. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, executing a small jump over a crack in the sidewalk. "Now we go home," David said. "Back to work, back to school, back to our regular life." "But it's not regular anymore, is it?" David considered the question. Tomorrow they would fly home to Ohio, to their small house and familiar routines. David would return to the innovation lab, continue developing solutions for problems that mattered. Marcus would return to fourth grade, to homework and friends, and the small dramas of childhood. But something fundamental had shifted. Not just in their circumstances, though those had changed dramatically, but in their understanding of what was possible when love met determination, when necessity drove creativity, when fathers and sons worked together to build something meaningful from whatever materials they could find. "No," David said finally, "it's not regular anymore." They continued walking as the sun set over Lake Geneva, father and son moving forward together, carried by wheels and hope and the quiet certainty that the best innovations came not from laboratories or boardrooms, but from the infinite creativity of love, refusing to accept that impossible things must remain impossible. Behind them, the convention center glowed with warm light, already preparing for tomorrow's sessions on technologies that would shape the future. But tonight belonged to a father and son who had learned that the future was built one improvised solution at a time, one act of love at a time, one moment of believing that discarded things could become beautiful things if you cared enough to see their potential. David reached out and took Marcus's hand as they walked, the same hands that had built a bicycle from office furniture, that had created possibility from desperation, that had proved that sometimes the smallest gestures echo the loudest and the simplest solutions change everything. The Geneva Convention Center faded behind them, but the story they'd shared there would continue forward, carrying them toward whatever came next, with the quiet confidence of people who knew that love, determination, and a willingness to see potential in discarded things could overcome any obstacle, solve any problem, and build any dream worth building.